Welcome to Global Risk Community Chat. Today our guest is Josh Gilbert. I'm very happy to have you here today, Josh. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, likewise. Thank you for joining us. So before we get into the topic, can you briefly introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, I'm Josh Gilbert. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Sust Global. Our mission is to develop data-driven products that enable every decision to be climate informed.
Cool. So that sounds really interesting what you're doing. So with that being said, then let's get into the topic of the day. So what would you like to share with us today?
I would like to share that climate risk is now financial risk, and there are really massive advances in the technology and in the products and in the capabilities that enable risk managers, supply chain operators, and investors to make climate informed decisions.
Nice. So then let's get into it and start with some key things or important things about this topic. The stage is yours. You can go ahead.
Sorry, you mean some important things about the broad topic of climate risk?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so I think, the world is changing very rapidly. Over $330 billion in economic damages have been caused by climate disasters. All of the models that exist today have been broken in recent years, and kind of the number of billion-dollar impact climate events is rising drastically away from the mean. As well as this, we kind of see regulatory risk and disclosures are increasing. Countries around the world are now making people or corporates and investors to disclose their climate-related risks. So there's a real opportunity to provide granular climate data for assets, properties, and portfolios anywhere on Earth. So that's what we provide at Sust Global, my startup. We founded 3 years ago. And what we do is we transform all of this climate complexity, all of this climate risk into easy to understand and frictionless APIs and data tooling to enable risk managers to very, very quickly assess this risk to their assets, to tangible assets like buildings, like manufacturing sites, like assets and supply chains, and allow them to assess that risk, to value that risk, and then mitigate that risk.
Yeah, and I know that climate risk is indeed one of the trending risk fields of the latest times. And what does this exactly mean for organizations? Because I can imagine that a lot of organizations would think, oh, we are a small company, or, we are not doing anything related to climate, even though, of course, I think everything is connected. But what does this mean from an organization perspective, regardless of their industry?
Yeah, so like I said, there's the regulatory side and there's the risk side. On the regulatory side, whether it's in the UK, in the EU, in the USA, in Canada, and Japan, there are now these climate disclosures that are coming in, if not this year, over 2023 and 2024. So anybody within a business has to disclose these climate risks by law. And that's a really important shift. It shows that actually this is going to be something that the strategic function and the C-suite need to be aware of. But secondly, the risk of actual events and the damages they cause is dramatically increasing as well. We've seen through COVID the impact on supply chains that has happened, and the huge global shortages of many, many, many products. And climate and the risks from climate change will be even larger than this. So, for example, if a company is in any way impacted by supply chains that are disaggregated throughout the world, there are many areas of the world that are increasingly at high levels of risk, and these risk management professionals and these corporates need to understand and mitigate these risks. So it could be finding a key part in the supply chain where maybe they diversify their risk by finding other manufacturers of this specific widget, or it could be finding ways to build in climate adaptation into their own facilities, by, for example, lifting things off the floor to avoid flooding, or to do vegetation management around a property in the case of wildfires. So there's the regulatory impact, there's the risk impact, and then there's actually the adaptation measures that these corporates can take to reduce their risk exposure.
Yes, that sounds good. Thank you so much for also sharing some steps that these organizations can take. With that being said, I want to get a bit maybe a more action step, I want to ask a question that is following that. So is there any takeaway points that you can share with our audience that they can start implementing right away? So if you were to, pick one thing or a few things that they should start right away with, which ones would that be?
I think the first thing is to assess the risk immediately. So whether it's to our platform, which is a cloud native, whether it's via API or via a dashboard, so say you were a corporate, you had 1,000 assets across the globe, you could upload them and then you could quickly view, do I have high risk at this location, low risk of wildfire, of flooding, of drought, of water scarcity, understanding maybe in 1 year, in 3 years, in 5 years, in 30 years, what are the different risks? So number one, the first step is just to assess and really understand where am I exposed? Because without that knowledge, it's very, very difficult to thrive in a changing planet. The second step is actually, I think, to quantify, to look at this and say, how does this affect us in terms of business continuity? We know the climate exposure. We know that, for example, we have a risk of wildfire at a facility, but what does that mean to us? Does that mean 15 down days throughout a year, which has, X millions of dollars of impact on our bottom line? Does it mean that actually, if our offices are flooded, can we just work from home and work on Zoom? So the materiality of those risks is actually very important. And then the last stage is actually whether it's through adaptation by, for example, making sure that foliage is far away from burnable things, whether it's lifting up things off of the ground in the case of flooding, or building flood defenses, or at a city level, maybe building flood defenses or seawalls in the case of sea level rise. There are these physical things that we can do. And then, of course, the final part is mitigation, understanding. So, for example, our platform, the Sust Global Climate Explorer, you can see what does the world look like in a 1.5 degree scenario, and how does that affect my assets? What does the world look like in a 3.5 degree scenario or a 5 degree scenario? Like, what are these different scenarios and what are the risks? And of course, we can adapt. Of course, many of us are already feeling climate change in parts of the world, for example, in India with the heat waves. But it's important to look at this, understand the changes on the planet, and find ways that we can reduce our emissions profile as well. So I think there's assess, there's quantify, then there's adapt, and then there's mitigate. These are the 4 steps that I would suggest.
Yes, thank you for sharing those 4 steps as well. I think they are super important, and I think every organization should start taking some action with those if they haven't yet. With that being said, I want to get into the last question, and that is how it is for you to be part of risk community.
Well, climate is a very new part of the risk community in some ways. Of course, everybody has always been aware of it, but the materiality of the risks is coming very quickly. Like I said at the start, climate risk is now financial risk, and that's changing the world of finance and investment. And it's also operational risk, and it's changing the world of risk management professionals. So whether it's phase 1 assurance, which is a very classic area of risk in the United States, where our data can be integrated via an API into this existing suite of kind of environmental consulting steps as you kind of check before you build a site, or integrating this type of data into an investment decision or a strategic decision or a supply chain decision. So it's a very exciting thing to be kind of dealing with such an important topic within the risk community. I think a big part of it is really educating people in the risk community how we can go from macro level events, saying the climate is changing, wildfire is getting worse in California, heat is a terrible thing in India, flooding in Southern Europe, going from these macro level things to going more granularly into what are the risks at the asset, portfolio, or property level, and how do we assess that? How do we adapt to that? How do we mitigate that? I think the risk community is very, very quickly being forced by regulation and by risks to integrate these new types of data. So for us, it's very exciting. We just want to meet new people, show people the products that we've built, and ultimately show them how they can adapt to this changing climate and thrive on a changing planet.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that as well. And with that being said, unfortunately, we have run out of our time. So I want to thank you once again for joining us today, sharing this important topic of climate risk, also in a macro level and a micro level, and I think it affects all of us and all organizations. So thank you so much for your insights.
Yeah, thank you so much. I do encourage the audience to reach out and connect, and happy to talk more.
Yes, have a great day.